Prime Minister today got a little short. All these questions about his voice, that kind of Aboriginal-only parliament that he wants to put in our constitution. Now, Anthony Albanese is a little bit miffed by all these questions that he's actually refusing to answer, like, will this unelected voice be able to stop government politicians and public servants from making any decision on anything, from taxes to foreign policy, until they ask this voice for its opinion?
And all of the noise that attempted to be created by opponents, declared and undeclared, to the voice, whether that be in the media, some sections of the media, or whether that be in the parliament, of talk about looking for every nuance to try to push out there what essentially will be a scare campaign. So you can have word games in this place or in the chamber there, but it's just word games.
It's just a scare campaign. It's just word games, is it? Well, joining me is James Allan, the Garrick Professor of Law at Queensland University. Professor Allan, always great to catch up with you. Look, I'm against the voice in principle, actually. The details, yes, but in principle, I'm against dividing us by race in our constitution. But is the Prime Minister right? The questions he's getting about how, in fact, this voice is going to work, just word games.
Well, thank you for having me, Andrew, and I'm against it on principle too. But look, law is word games. I'm not even really sure what he's talking about. This is not a modest change to our Constitution. It's a major change. It's going to afford special rights to a certain proportion of the population, whether you say that's based on race or just some other criterion like things you're born with. The fact is, it goes down the path of identity politics and group rights. In theory, the way it's worded, it could apply to any bill that's before Parliament. So it is a massive change. And the idea that you dismiss it as word games, well, that's all lawyers do, is play word games. So I really have no clue at all what Mr. Albanese is trying to do. He has set up a constitutional expert group without a single skeptic. There's really no conservatives unless you count Greg Craven, and he really hasn't been a constitutional conservative. For 20 years, the man was in favor of the Republic. I mean, it's hard to describe him as a constitutional conservative. So I don't agree with anything the Prime Minister just said.
But James Allan, how do you think the voice will work? Because you said, in theory, there's nothing, and it's true, when you have a look at the words that the government wants us to vote on, right, you could drive a truck through it, but they say, well, look, it's not meant the voice is not meant to be talking about anything except matters directly affecting Aborigines. I don't see that in the actual words. Do you think it will be limited to, as the Prime Minister says?
Almost certainly not. They don't say that. They make it open to anything. It says may make representations on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and any bill might satisfy that criteria. And it makes what Parliament can do subject to this Constitution. And the Constitution will have that provision in it. And so it, in theory, throws anything open. And let me remind viewers that it was only 2.5, 3 years ago that the High Court of Australia delivered the Love decision, which was an exercise in French deconstructionist mumbo jumbo. They talked about, I got to read it to you here, a bit of it. In this decision, they talked about otherness and deeper truths and metaphysical connections to the land. And they ended up saying that Indigenous peoples can possess certain rights and duties that are not possessed by non-Indigenous people in Australia. It was a terrible decision. I mean, I've spent a quarter of a century reading constitutional cases from around the Anglosphere, and this was the worst one ever. And these are the people we're going to hand this over to. And Mr. Albanese wants us to think that there's no scope at all for judicial adventurism. I mean, frankly, it's laughable. Now, it is true that most... Well,
that case you mentioned, James, that case you mentioned for viewers, what it meant was that the High Court discovered somehow a law that prevented a criminal who was born overseas, but had some Aboriginal ancestor way back when, could come here and not be deported for, as you know, for his crimes, because he had a connection to the land, having Aboriginal blood coursing through his veins, even though he'd been born overseas. It's quite extraordinary. But James, the point is this. Albanese said today, no, we've made this watertight. This idea of ours for a voice will never get to the courts, will never get to the high courts, where the judges can then, you know, start saying, well, look, what this in fact means is that governments must consult the voice and they can never act without the voice having an opinion, and discover all kinds of other rights for this voice. Do you believe him?
Well, actually, I bet my mortgage he's wrong. Look, something broadly analogous happened back in 1982 in Canada. I'm a native-born Canadian, and they brought in a new constitution, and people were worried about how the judges would go completely crazy, because at that point, Canadian judges were the most interpretively conservative in the world. And we got all these assurances, and they put in a Section 33 notwithstanding. And within 6 years, the judges went berserk. You know, they went from the most interpretively conservative to they're more activist in Canada now than the American judges. And this all happened despite top judges and experts saying this will never happen. It's going to happen. I can tell you right now, I bet big money that if you put this in, the same judges who delivered love are going to, it won't happen right away. It won't happen the first 3 or 4 years. Give it half a dozen years, maybe a dozen. And, you know, just look at the kinds of people who are going through law schools and the way they're being educated. This gives judges a power that's in the Constitution that Parliament cannot second guess. And at some point it will be invoked, and it's going to be incredibly divisive. And we're not even talking yet, Andrew, about the political reality that even whatever your views on the legal future likelihoods, politically, the left side of politics is going to love what the voice recommends, and the right side of politics has the backbone of an amoeba. And it's the same in Canada. And they will not stand up to this body. So politically, when you go into the ballot box, you're not voting for anything other than what is likely to transpire. And what's likely to transpire is a voice body that politically gets its way or has to be bought off in some rent-seeking way. This is a terrible constitutional amendment. And you know it's terrible.
Look, you make a good point. I saw judges already in Victoria's version of The Voice actually stand in a smoking ceremony before they handed their, before they rubber stamped it. I mean, seriously. And I have a very good example tomorrow as well of what the nonsense going on. James Allan, thank you for your time.